Hello, my name is Carolina Gaitan, and I played the student and the third observer.
Hi, I'm Kayla Arpin, and I play the instructional assistant and the first author.
The name of our study is Self-Monitoring and On-Task Behavior. The original study was done by Boswell, Knight, and Spriggs in 2013. The study studied the effects of self-monitoring and on-task behavior of an 11-year-old boy with moderate intellectual disabilities, and they used a motivator to see if self-monitoring increased on-task behavior and academic performance. They used an AB-AB research design to record data intervals using momentary time sampling. In addition, they recorded math fluency by having a pre-test after the first baseline and a post-test after the second intervention. Math fluency was determined with a 2-minute long pre and post-test consisting of math problems. And they also had a training phase where the instructional assistant trained the student to self-monitor. And the results indicated that there was a behavioral change due to the intervention, meaning that self-monitoring did affect on-task behavior. So self-monitoring and other studies. So self-monitoring is described as recording one's own behavior. There have been several studies that have indicated an effect of on-task behavior when using this procedure. By using self-monitoring technique, one is able to record their own behavior, whether they're on task or not on task, which can have some benefits in increasing academic performance, task completion, and other school setting behaviors. One study done by Lech DeBar and Albert Morgan in 2010, they used a multiple baseline research design to determine the effects of self-monitoring on task behavior on 3 students with disabilities. And there were 3 males with ASD and other disabilities. They used a multiple baseline across students' design, and their findings demonstrated a functional relation between self-monitoring and while using a tactile prompt and increased on-task behavior. They used as well a motivator to see if self-monitoring affected on-task behavior and if students could accurately self-record their own task. And in this study, they also used math assignments during their study like the original. Our second study, done by Stasola, Pirilli, and Damiani in 2014, had similar results to their study. They as well used self-monitoring to promote on-task behavior in the classroom. And in this study, they had 2 high-functioning males with ASD and ADHD. These participants experienced body rocking and voice noises, and other exhibited hand flapping and washing. In this study, they used a non-concurrent multiple baseline design across participants, followed by a maintenance phase. And they used self-monitoring procedure to increase their on-task behavior and reduce their stereotype behaviors by allowing the student to become self-aware of their behaviors. So the purpose of our study was to determine the effects of self-monitoring and on-task behavior and whether self-monitoring increases reading fluency. So the operational definitions for our behaviors is on-task behavior is operationally defined as sitting down and looking, reading, and looking at a book or doing an assignment. Off-task behavior is walking around, not looking, nor reading any assignments, or talking to someone else in the vicinity or on the phone. And this includes texting or on social media. And studying was defined as reading a book / article, writing notes, completing assignments, and it wasn't limited to watching videos or writing discussion boards. Self-monitoring was described as self-reporting on fixed interval schedules of 3 minutes. An example of self-monitoring is documenting every 3 minutes whether on-task behavior is occurring using the Am I Working form. And a non-example of studying is searching the web for subjects unrelated to the assignment, for instance, online shopping. So the participants in our study was a female college student that had difficulty staying on task behavior. during schoolwork times. The setting was in her home, for example, her study room or in the dining room area. And the materials we used was the interval timer app, the momentary time sampling sheet, visual aid, an edible reinforcer, Microsoft Excel, and Word. So like the original study, we did not use the motivator that they used. We replaced it with an interval timer app. We did not have access to the motivator, so we couldn't use it here. And you can see here some of the visual aids that we used. For example, the Am I Working index card, where the student checked whether they were on or off task at the end of each 3-minute interval, and a little visual aid to remind the student what on-task behavior looked like. So the design of our study was an AB research design like the original study. And in this design, it has 4 phases, 2 baseline and 2 intervention phases. During the first phase, which is the baseline, we recorded on-task behavior without the motivator and with the visuals. So it was in the natural setting, and the student was not fully aware of the data being collected. And during the first intervention, that's when we implemented the procedure once there was a stable trend during the baseline. And during the intervention phase, we used self-monitoring and the motivator and a 3-minute interval timer and the visuals. The second baseline went back to recording the behavior in the natural environment. So we withdrew the intervention. And then on the last phase, the intervention phase, we use the self-monitoring for the behavior. So data collection, we collected data using a momentary time sampling sheet, and it was on a fixed interval of 3 minutes long. So we also collected data on the pre-test, which we recorded reading fluency instead of math fluency. We thought this would be easier, and since it's related. So we collected data on the amount of pages read before the intervention was prevented. We also collected data using the Am I Working index card. So this is what the student used to record her behavior. And we also collected data using a video recording device in our laptop for IOA and treatment integrity purposes, as well as a means to share data between the other members. Once the data was collected, we shared it with the other member in the group. And we also collected data in the post-test phase, which was done after the last intervention phase. And it was done as well on the reading fluency, the amount of pages read. So baseline phase, in more detail, it was recorded in the home setting where studying usually took place, and it was done with the laptop camera. So there was a total of 5 phases in the baseline phase, 5 sessions in the baseline phase, which was 15 minutes long. The student recorded at the end, during the recording, the other member recorded at the end of each minute whether the student was on or off task. So using the interval app, it vibrated and beeped at the end of each 3 minutes. And then once the video was recorded, we sent it to the other member and we collected IOA and integrity. The first treatment phase, so this was implemented once there was a stable trend in the baseline. So after the 5 sessions, and during this phase, the student used the interval app during the homework session, and the student observed their behavior, whether it was on task or off task. The student used an Am I Working index card and put a check mark or a plus or minus sign in each interval box, whether for a check mark for on task and a minus sign, or an X for off task. And then the observer on the other side observed using a momentary time sampling sheet. Sessions were recorded and then shared with each other at the end of each recording. So we also had a pre and post test. This was for the reading fluency. So in these phases, we used a 3-minute long pre and post test. In the original study, they had a 2-minute long math fluency. So they recorded how many math problems the student could finish within 2 minutes. We thought that 2 minutes was too short to record a reading fluency, so we did a 3-minute long pre and post test. So the pretest was done right after the initial baseline phase, and the amount of pages were recorded before treatment was implemented. During the post-test, as well, it was 3 minutes long, and it was after the last treatment phase, and it was how many pages were read after treatment had been implemented. Our IOA was done 60% of all phases, which equal to 10 sessions during the whole study. And we collected 100% IOA on the reading fluency, which was a pre and post test. We used a point-by-point method of IOA. And this was done by calculated by dividing the number of agreements by total number of agreements and disagreements multiplied by 100. And we collected IOA by recording every session, every study session. And so we had, physical data, and we were able to share with other members where they recorded whether we were actually on or off task behavior. So the results were 100% intra-observer agreement during the 60% of all sessions, and we had 100% IOA for the pre and post tests. Treatment integrity, so this was done by using a treatment integrity checklist formulated by Wilkinson in 2016. And we did this during the training and intervention phases. During the training of the instructional assistant, we used a 6 yes or no question integrity checklist, and integrity was determined by dividing the number of correctly implemented steps by the total number of steps and multiplied by 100. So right here on the right, you can see the 6 yes and no questions that we used for determining treatment integrity. So one of them is, review the behavior goals and visual card to the student, cued the student for self-monitoring, rated the student, rewarded an edible reinforcer if the student was recording herself correctly, rewarded if behavior goal was met, and so on. We also had a checklist for the 11-point checklist to determine if the trainer was training the student correctly to self-monitor or not. So this was done on the instructional assistant, not the student himself. So the student training checklist had 11 points, and right here on the right, you can see the one that we used. And it was also formulated by Wilkinson, I believe. And now Kayla with the results.
So as you can see from our graph, the intervals of on-task behavior were higher during both intervention phases than they were during the baseline phases. Next. Our results in baseline 1, the student had an average of 56% on-task behavior. After baseline 1, we gave the 3-minute pre-test. During that pre-test, the student was able to read 1 page and 1 paragraph. During intervention 1, when we implemented the self-monitoring, her on-task behavior jumped to 84%. During baseline 2, it went back down to 53%. And then during intervention 2, it jumped 40% to 93%. After the second intervention, we gave the post-test, and during the post-test, she was able to read 1 page in the 3 minutes. Next. There were limitations to our study. For example, the participant knew she was being watched, and there were many interruptions, such as her dogs needing attention, her roommate coming home, and her cell phone ringing. So the results may be skewed due to the lack of control that we had. Also, we only had 1 participant. We were a group of 2, so that left 1 person to play the role of the student. We also recorded all sessions in the student's home, so that shows a lack of generalization. We don't know if the results would be the same if she was in a library or a school setting. We also did not have a lot of time, so our phases did not show a stable trend, and more sessions would be beneficial. During the pre and post test, the student knew she was being recorded and therefore tried to read as quickly as possible. We also always conducted our sessions around 7:30 p.m. So we don't know if the results would be different if we chose to record at a different time maybe in the morning or in the afternoon, we could have had different results. Also, not being in the same room was a limitation. In the original study, the instructional assistant was in the same room as the student. Our student knew she was being watched, but I was not there to encourage her to stay on task as the instructional assistant was in the original study. Next. So in the future, if this study were to be replicated again, having more participants would definitely be beneficial to see if all of the participants were able to increase their on-task behavior by using self-monitoring. It would also be beneficial to use more than one setting and to have more time. As Carolina mentioned earlier, the original study used a motivator and we did not have access to that. So we used the interval timer app on our phones, which would make a sound every 3 minutes. The difference between using the app and the motivator is that the motivator actually vibrated as well. So that could have been more motivating than just hearing the sound. Next. So in conclusion, self-monitoring is an effective intervention for increasing on-task behavior while studying. The percentage of a time on task increased during intervention phases, and the on-task behavior fluctuated greatly during baseline, but there was less fluctuation during the intervention phases. For example, during baseline, the on-task behavior fluctuated from 20% to 80%, but during the intervention phases, it only fluctuated from 60 to 40%. Therefore, we do feel that there is a functional relationship between self-monitoring and on-task behavior. However, during the pre-test, the student was able to read a paragraph more than she was during the post-test. So we did not find a functional relationship between self-monitoring and reading fluency. But again, our results may be skewed due to a lack of control. Next.
So this was our own thoughts of the study. There was some pros and cons to the study, and I'm going to go over the cons. So I knew that I was being recorded during the post baseline phases and even intervention phases. And unlike the original study where the student was not aware that he was being recorded, this affected our data and potentially the results. And we could have having more members in our group could have affected the results tremendously. They could have been a generalization between members, or even some members could have not benefited from self-monitoring like I did.
As for the pros, we had our sessions recorded. So I think that helped have a really high IOA, because if we were distracted and we didn't catch something, we could always go back and watch the videos and see what exactly was happening when the timer went off. Also, knowing that self-monitoring increases on-task behavior is something that we can use to benefit us in our future assignments. So Carolina, do you have any thoughts about our replication?
I don't have any thoughts, but besides the fact that I think I kind of benefited from the actual self-monitoring. Like I find myself now being more on task than I normally would. And sorry, let me hide this. Okay. And I feel like I complete more assignments faster than I was before, we started this study. I also don't have my phone with me at all times anymore. And I kind of just focus more and don't have the, anxiety of having my phone and having to check it as much.
Right. I feel the same. Self-monitoring is something that I used frequently with my students to get them to be more aware of their own behavior. And they would have sheets just like we used. Instead of am I working, it would be towards whatever behavior they were targeting. So when I paired those sheets, the self-monitoring, with a reinforcer, usually an edible one, but one that they got to choose, their behavior would increase or decrease depending on what our goal was. So I'd never thought to use that intervention with myself, but now since we've done this study, I do find myself self-monitoring a lot more and then rewarding myself with a break at the end. And I think that it has also increased my behavior or my on-task behavior and my motivation.
Yes, I definitely think that with the edible reinforcer or any reinforcer that we had, have the motivation for, I also find myself, having to study for 30 minutes and then rewarding myself with a 5-minute break or, like a snack break, and then coming back and having studying more on task behavior longer than I did before. So I think
Right.
it kind of, helped us out a little bit, and maybe we can still use it for ourselves or even others.
I agree. I use the interval timer to check myself when I'm studying to make sure I'm on task when I should be, because otherwise I find myself very distracted throughout the process.
Yes. So Kayla, do you have any final thoughts?
I think that about sums it up.
Alrighty.